It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It's Take Command. That's Logan Paulsen. I'm Craig Hoffman. He played 10 years in the NFL. I've covered it for about that long. Different 10 years though. At this point, Logan, you've covered it for like 5.
I know, it is crazy. When I was talking to someone about the other day, and I was like, "Oh, my last year in the NFL was and I was like, "Dang, that was like a long time ago now." It was like 2019 was my last year, so about 5 years, which is pretty wild, man. Time's flying.
Time is flying. And we were just talking right before we started recording. Time's flying. We'll be in Indianapolis next week for the NFL Combine. So we'll make some fun plans around that. Not sure exactly the schedule, but we promise for whatever chaos we throw in your listening schedule, we'll make up for it with excellent content from Indianapolis. So looking forward to that. But today it's a mailbag. We'll do our first, and I guess only pre-Combine mock draft, but our first mock draft in total on Thursday. We'll get to that then. As for today, Logan, we're going to start with a question that you got on Instagram from Peter, which is one that I think is weighing heavily on a lot of Commanders fans' minds. And it goes, CJ Stroud's sophomore slump was a well-publicized narrative of the last season. What is the most likely reason Jayden would experience such a slump, and what are the ways that he / the team can ensure such a slump doesn't happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is, to me, the thing that keeps me up at night is this question. And I think it's something that a lot of teams and coaches think about quite a bit. And so at the highest level, the simplest reason that people have slumps is that they go from being on a bad team with a losing record and, most importantly, a losing schedule. And all of a sudden, next year, they're going to be playing better football teams. They're playing better. And I don't care if those teams, everyone says, oh, it's hard to predict schedules moving into a new season. Honestly, I 100% agree with that, but I will say they're playing better quarterbacks. So you're going to be leveraged in different situations. You're going to be probably trailing in more games. You're going to be having to kind of win games in a different way. Like, think about this year. Like, they were always kind of in a relatively good game flow. All of a sudden, you have to make up 10 points in the fourth quarter. You're throwing the ball around the yard. You throw a couple more interceptions over the course of the year, right? Your passer rating goes down a little bit. That's the type of thing you're talking about here. And to me, that's maybe the main reason why you see regressions in the sophomore season is just like you're going against better competition. And also, we talked about this a ton. I've talked about this on Command Center a ton. It's the number one thing about the NFL that's so difficult is there is no like easy week, right? There's no easy offseason. If you talk to Santana, like one of the things that made Santana Moss one of the best receivers of his generation is he never took an offseason. He was like, I took 2 weeks when the season was over, and then I'm back to working out. I'm back to getting better. And that's the thing that's so hard about the NFL is if you, for 1 second, think that, oh, I'm there, you're not there. And that's when everybody else catches up to you. That's when defenses figure you out. And I think that is something that I think Jayden is very adept at kind of dealing with because we've seen his kind of mentality. But I'm telling you, it is hard to keep sharpening the sword, man. It is hard to keep doing that. And I think that's where you see, again, the strength of schedule changes, but also just the challenge of kind of that methodical approach becomes very difficult as well.
I think it's also important to point out that the biggest factor in CJ Stroud's quote-unquote sophomore slump was their offensive line / their protection plans were absolutely horrendous. They were so bad that Bobby Slowick went from a guy that was looked at for head coaching positions to a guy that got fired.
How crazy is that, by the way? That's insane.
It's absolutely crazy. And I think, people then go, well, why couldn't that happen to Kliff? Is Kliff an idiot for not taking the Saints job, for instance? Because what if that happens to him? Kliff has been doing this so much longer than Bobby Slowick has. Kliff is not an old guy by any stretch, but like Kliff's been calling plays and, he was an OC way before Bobby Slowick was. And, Bobby came out of that Kyle Shanahan tree. And there's been a lot of, Mike McDaniel, et cetera, has come out of that tree and done really well. But like Kyle does a lot of stuff. And so it was really embarrassing, frankly, how bad not just their offensive line played. Like you can have bad players, but like Laramie Tunsil 2 years ago was maybe the best left tackle in all of football. Yeah. And now they can't keep Stroud upright. They have very easily manipulated protection plans. And so they're able to get blitzes, like teams were able to get blitzes home against them. You had guys playing poorly, so it doesn't seem like they were coached very well from a technique standpoint, and guys are just getting crushed one-on-one. So that was the biggest factor, is you got to be able to protect your quarterback. Now, that is going to become harder against tougher schedules and better pass rushes and all those things. You got the Chiefs and Spagnuolo on the schedule next year. You're going to have all these really high-end performers on the schedule. But at the same time, like Kliff and Bobby Johnson and all those guys, Anthony Lynn, it was very, very clear they spent a lot of time thinking about the protection plan. It is something that they are really adept at. And hopefully they're going to also improve, and we'll talk about this with a couple of questions coming up. They're also going to improve the personnel on the offensive line. So I think that part of it, both that Kliff is going to Bobby Slowick style turn into a pumpkin, and that the protection won't be there, those are not really concerns for me. It is more of just now they've got a year of tape. It's a more difficult schedule. But I think the kind of worker Jayden is, and the humility he brings to the game, and frankly, the fact that he's kind of good at everything. And this has been my thing with Jayden when people want to exclude him from being in the top 5. Like, I was listening to a show yesterday, and they're listing off their top 5 quarterbacks, and they have Justin Herbert over Jayden. And I don't think that's the craziest thing ever. But the fact that Jayden wasn't even mentioned, I'm like, well, you tell me the thing that he doesn't do well. I'll wait. Mm-hmm. And between his ability to scramble, design run, throw short, throw long, throw over the middle, throw to the outside, quick release, big arm vertically down the field, I just don't know. Will he have a bad week? Absolutely. But I just don't know the way that you really test him, because he has shown an ability to figure everything out that's thrown at him. And so that to me is the question, is does a defensive coordinator somewhere find some kind of dent in the armor that he then has to figure out, and how quickly can he do that?
Yeah, and I think, and again, it's just, to me, when you play better football teams, those little, slight disruptions in the armor become more exasperated. You just get leverage more. You have to do more challenging things. And I think about some of the things that he did so well this year in terms of passing efficiency, first down passing efficiency, fourth down efficiency. They were 87% on fourth down conversion this year.
Yeah, it was the best that any team had done in 25 years. They're very likely not going to do that again. Then again, I said no one would repeat CJ Stroud's rookie year, and Jayden did better. So I've come to feel like I should caveat everything around Daniels at this point.
But I'm just saying, there's going to be some type of statistical regression, right? Winning one-score game, statistical regression. All these things where you're riding variance, eventually you keep rolling the dice, and it's going to come up the other way. And so that's something that you look at, is are you going to be able to rely on that level of offensive efficiency? Probably not. Even though Jayden might be the same player, he might be playing at approximately the same level. One of the things that, again, when you look at the things that elevate, I had to do a project where it was what made this offense good? They were, I think, 3rd in the NFL in third down conversion. They were number 1 in fourth down conversion. We talked about how important it was that they possessed the football this year, and they did that they couldn't have done it any better. And usually those things year on year, especially when you play better teams, especially when you play better offenses, especially when you play defensive coordinators that are used to playing better quarterbacks, that's going to come back. So all of a sudden, all these hidden yardage, all these opportunities for Jayden Daniels to get a lot of touches on the football, especially in the quick game. Again, because when you look at Jayden Daniels, average depth of target, it's kind of right smack dab in the middle, maybe slightly below average in terms of the league. And obviously, one of the things that makes him good is that he gets a lot of bites at the apple. You go on 15 play drives, 16 play drives, 18 play drives. And when that doesn't happen, we've seen how that happens. I think the first Giants game is a great example of that. When they can't operate with that level of efficiency, it leverages the defense. It puts the offense in a bad spot. And that's where you would see a regression. Literally, if their third down percentage dropped 5 points and their fourth down percentage dropped 10 points, you're going to see a regression in his statistical efficiency. That's really what you're talking about in terms of margin for error. Now, I want to talk about the other thing you're talking about here with the protection plans and things like that.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a huge element, right? And we've talked about that in terms of things to look at in the draft, things to look at in free agency. You always have to be building up that group in terms of personnel. But I do think when you look at Kliff's plans, and especially the way that Biadasz executed some of these calls and targeted the protections, like you feel really good about the floor of that group, So like obviously you want to get better from a personnel standpoint, but when you see Kliff, when you see all the coaching staff, I think they have a really good understanding of like how to maximize Jayden. And there are times, like for example, in the first Dallas game and the second Dallas game, I thought the defensive coordinator for Dallas did a great job scheming up blitzes. But the one thing about Kliff is that he's like a grinder, man. You can tell, like they prep and they really kind of get in the weeds in terms of making sure they have answers to protection. That's what makes good offense, really, is making sure you have good protection plans. So that's something I'm not that concerned about. But again, you're going to see more straight drop back situations. You're going to see more one-on-ones with the offensive linemen. You're going to see more straight blitz opportunities where they can implement some of these kind of exotic blitz packages and things like that. And again, that's just going to leverage the offensive line, put him under more pressure. And I think that's where you see kind of, and we're kind of using CJ Stroud as a comparison here, but I think that's where you see a general sophomore slump for most guys, right? It just becomes a little bit harder in year two because everything's a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Anything else on sophomore slump? Did you have a sophomore slump? How did year two compare to year one for you? Obviously, incredibly different circumstances.
Yeah.
You were a rotational tight end, and Jayden is a starting quarterback who was on the verge of an MVP candidate. But what do you remember year one to year two?
Yeah, I think for me, like I kind of redshirted my first year, right? I basically played special teams. I was like, a short yardage goal line tight end in the offense. And then year two, I ended up starting 4 games. So I kind of upped the difficulty. And then my third year, I ended up starting like 8-9 games that year. So it kind of was a natural progression for me. And I didn't have to take on too much responsibility until I was ready, which again is one of the things about, we'll talk about this maybe on a different show, but when you're a low round pick, you're under a lot of pressure early on to make the team. But once you're in the team and once you've kind of showed your professionalism, there is an ability to kind of foster growth if you continue to develop. And again, like the challenge for me was just to kind of stay focused, like making sure that you're working alone, like working individually, because they don't really care about your development, but finding a way to be self-motivated. And so that's a little bit different than Jayden, obviously, but to me, the number one thing, the most challenging thing about the NFL is you have to be better than you were yesterday. That's the number one thing. And the guys that are really good do that at an extremely high level. And the guys that struggle or fizzle out or are flash in the pans 1-2 good years and they're gone, they lose the ability to do that. And I think that's where you're going to learn a lot about Jayden from year 1 to year 2. I think I know the answer, but again, that's the difficult thing for him.
Right. And based off everything we know about him, he's going to be just fine.
Right.
But we don't know 100% until we know. I'd say the one thing for him is just, we talked about this with Philly going into the game and then coming out of it is you don't blitz, you play man coverage. And part of that is then can you improve the guys that he's throwing to as well, because they've got to win on routes. That's kind of the one area where teams statistically did pretty well against him. So I'm sure that they're getting in the lab this offseason to work on that. Take command, Logan Paulsen there, Craig Hoffman here as we answer your mailbag questions. If you'd like to submit them, you can go to hoffmanshow.com. Use the contact link. You can also send us a message on Instagram at Logan_Paulsen82 or at Hoffman.sports. This one came in the inbox, Logan, from Justin. He said, "Hi, Craig. I would love to have a greater understanding of the type of athlete/skill set that Kingsbury is looking for on the offensive line. Schematically, how does the offensive line work on the running game?" So I think the big one that I would like to tackle is the first part of Justin's question. Maybe we do an entire episode on run game stuff eventually. But as we head towards Indianapolis next week and the draft, and we're doing all these mock drafts and all that kind of stuff, when you look at Kliff and also Bobby Johnson, like what are they looking for, you think, in an offensive lineman? Have you been able to tell yet?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of working through that still a little bit. I think I look at the 2 guys that they brought in. Bobby Hart is kind of a bigger body. He's like 340 pounds. He's like 6'5". And then obviously the gentleman we talked about when we did our draft review is Amin Dakwa, who's, he's 360. Those are big dudes in the NFL. And, Dakwa's like 6'8". And again, you're always chasing body types, you're always chasing development, but this is where it gets a little bit funny because people say, oh, well, now you go find the biggest offensive lineman in the draft and you insert them into this system. That's not exactly how that would work, right? And obviously, big offensive linemen are valuable in the type of system that they run. They run a little bit of tight zone. They run a lot of zone read, like where you're kind of going downhill. It's going to play and feel to the defense like duo, right? We're not going anywhere. We're trying to move guys off the spot. And obviously, getting big, explosive guys are very helpful with that. And so I think those two additions kind of reflect that. You know what I mean? They reflect that type of mentality. However, they also run a lot of what I would call bounce, or what I would counter, like these power schemes where you have to have the offensive lineman pull. And while they don't need to be as straight up, ballerina athletic as like an outside zone team, for example, they do need to have some level of athleticism. So you're looking for kind of this, again, a good offensive lineman is a paradox, right? It's someone who's incredibly physical and big, but also has some ability to move and be functional in space. And so that's, to me, is I think where it's, if I was going to give it a name, right? They want a bigger body who can pull and help them attack the perimeter. And I think when you look at Sam Cosmi is a really interesting example, kind of an undersized guard, relatively speaking, when you look around the NFL, but he gives them a lot of flexibility in terms of how they run screens, how they get to the perimeter. Even Wiley, for all of his shortcomings, I think he had a really good year this year because you can run tackle trap, you can run screens to his side, you can get on the perimeter and get that stuff done. And we talked about this earlier in the year, Cornelius Lucas is, I think, a really good pass protector. But I think early in the season when he was playing a lot, he really, I think, hurt their ability to kind of run screens, run tackle traps, run bounce where he's got to pull because he's not that fleet of foot. And when you look at Brandon Coleman, again, he's a bigger, wider body guy. He's 325 pounds. He's 6'4", but he has this tremendous foot speed. And I think when you look at what they did in Arizona, right, Humphreys was a guy that, again, was a heavier guy. He was in that 320 range, maybe 330, but he's 6'4". He's a little sawed off, but can run and get in space. And so I think that's kind of what you're looking for, is kind of a thick lower half guy, guy with big legs, kind of a big trunk, but can help you with some of this movement stuff. And so that's where you're not looking for the biggest dude you can find. You're looking for a guy that's kind of that wrestler movement skill, but also has the ability to run an effective gap scheme run.
Yeah, but I think of some of the best offensive linemen in the league, and certainly the best guy that I covered, the best guy you played with was the same guy. It was Trent, right? Yeah. Trent's enormous. He is, 6'3", 6'4", 335 pounds?
I mean, he would fluctuate between, 355 and, there were times where he'd cut down to 325, but that's a big dude. He's a heavy, strong, functionally strong guy. And I think and again, he's a kind of a tough example because he's the best offensive lineman I've ever seen play. You know what I mean? But That's kind of the body type.
But what made him that was he had that body type and then could move. And I remember, Trent, I actually did a story once on Trent Williams' feats of athleticism. And I just went around the locker room and asked a bunch of different guys, what's the craziest thing you've ever seen Trent do? And Adrian Peterson was on the team at the time. And obviously they go back to Oklahoma together. And, he was one day we were in the gym, and this is Trent at this point isn't, Trent's not a guy who's super cut up. You look at him and you're like, that's the best athlete I've ever seen. And you're like, no, seriously, that's the best athlete I've ever seen. But he was even doughier, if you will, his freshman year at Oklahoma. And Adrian told me that he just stood under the rim in the basketball gym, and from a standstill, not even from on the run, did a 360 between the legs dunk.
Dude. I remember he was in slides when he was 350. He was big. And we went to the gym to do our walkthrough. He's in slides, sock slides, totally not athletic footwear, and did a freaking tomahawk dunk off of a vert. He just was one of the most, he covered punts in college. He is a freak athlete. Yeah. And his ability to move in space, and
the last thing I was going to say is his ability to hit in space. Yeah. Because that's the thing, is it's not just can you get out and can you get a big locomotive moving? It's, do you have the agility to then hit a little guy in space? Because I remember talking to Trent, and Trent told me the hardest thing I have to do is not stand there and block a Myles Garrett or whatever. It's when I get out on those pulls and everyone's thinking I'm going to go get someone. You got this little 180-pound guy that wants to juke you. Can I actually hit him? Can I actually bury the corner in the way that I'm expected to do? And he said, that's the hardest thing I had to do. And so that's the hard part, right? Is you need big man, the ability to move in little space.
Well, dude, I'm telling you, like everyone talks about, you just make a cut up a Trent blocking in space, like his ability to close the distance, come to balance, and explode through his hips. Like he looks like a linebacker when he does it, or like a
Yeah.
fullback. You know what I mean? He's that explosive. And so obviously, like that's the gold standard of movement at the position. Like, you know, he ran like a 4.78 or 4.79 at the combine. I think he was like 320 at the time. Like he's a crazy athlete, right? But then you get like, again, go through your top tackles. Like that's what you're looking for. And the reason
I was going to say Mailata was the other guy I was thinking of like crazy big movement skills are outrageously good.
I mean, Tristan Wirfs, Penei Sewell, like there's a reason those guys are the top 8 guys in the NFL, right? Is because they can do all the things. They don't limit your offense in any way from an athletic standpoint. They can pass protect, they can run, they can get to the second level, they can get out on the screen. Like, and that's why that guy is so valuable. Like, you know, I was actually talking to somebody who I have a lot of respect for as an offensive play caller. And I said, you know, why is Kyle Shanahan having such a hard time right now calling plays? And he's like, they rely on the left tackle so much. And he's a playmaking element in their offense because of, you can slide protections away. You can, you know, get him out on screens. You can pull him, you can trap him, you can rely on him to take 2 and get to the second level. And so when you get in that top threshold of offensive linemen, like you turn on the film, man, and it impacts a game. And so obviously, like that's the extreme version of that. There's nobody in this draft class that moves like those guys, right? That can do that.
No.
But you want to find a mold of a guy who brings a little bit more size, a little bit more density, and a little bit, and you don't want to lose the movement skill, right? I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, for example, like I think of Orlando Brown all the time because he's this massive guy. He's 360. He's pretty good in pass pro, but he kills your offense from a run game standpoint. He just kills it. Now, a lot of teams are okay with that because of his ability to pass protect. I don't think Kliff is okay with that. I don't think this offense is okay with that. You need someone who's got that size, not 360, but that 320 to 340 kind of range that can run and get to the second level. Where, like, you know, talking about draft, like guys like Jalen Travis from Iowa State, he's 6'7", he's 345, he's got long arms, he's got decent movement skills. Like even him, I'm like, are you good enough to do it? The guy that really sticks out to me, if you want like a just someone that I was like, this guy could be a commander, not from a work ethic standpoint, so get that out of your mind right now, but from a snap movement skill standpoint, is Anthony Belton from NC State. He's like 6'5", he's 345, he's got long arms, he can run a little bit. Now he's all over the place from technique standpoint, but if you just look at the athlete, I think that's kind of the model of what you're looking for. A guy that can play inside, outside, gives you some flexibility on the O-line. But that body type to me is like perfect. He can pull, he can block on a screen, and you don't really lose any juice. But he's still got this big body that can move people in gap scheme runs.
For sure. I feel like this is a good follow-up from Brian that we should tack onto this part of the pod. Brian asks, when evaluating linemen on either side, how tall is too tall? You sometimes see these guys at 6'8" or 6'9", and I wonder how they're going to get leverage on anyone. Is there such a thing as too tall, or is bigger always better, all else being equal?
Yeah, I mean, there are offensive linemen that are too tall, you know, because they can't bend. And so when you're talking offensive line play, it's really, you're talking athletes. Like, so the guy that you want to play basketball is the guy you want to play offensive line. And I know that sounds like a contradiction, but that's kind of the movement skills you want. Like, you know, like everyone did that, like, you know, house basketball league where they pound the floor, they bend in their hips and they do the side shuffles. Essentially, that's what offensive line play is. So the guys that are bad at that are the guys that bend at the waist, their chest is facing the floor. And usually those really, really tall guys have a hard time bending at the hips, bending at the knees, keeping a vertical torso, right? And being able to sink and rise on contact because they're just so damn tall. So that's why Joe Alt, for example, is a total outlier because he's pretty bendy in the hips, pretty bendy in the knees, pretty bendy in the ankles, and while also being very tall. Like there's a bunch of tall guys in this year's draft class, like Ozzie Trapillo from Boston College. He's 6'7". He's got 33-inch arms. He's a good football player. He might be a starting right tackle in the NFL, but the thing that makes you worried is he just can't bend enough. So like at contact, his helmet is always higher than the defender's helmet. So he's going to get stoned in the run game. In pass pro, if someone's got a really aggressive rip move, you can't reach down and touch that guy, right? And so to me, like the kind of sweet spot for, like, obviously there's outliers. There's outliers, you know.
Right. Mailata's 6'8".
Yeah, right. There's outliers, but Mailata is a unicorn athlete, right? The way
right.
like, watching,
he grew up playing rugby in Australia.
Yeah.
Like he literally grew up playing a different sport with the different movement skills that required a lot more movement skills than the shuffling that we think of for an offensive lineman.
Yeah, and so he's like watching him warm up. Like, shoot, he could play tight end, man. Like that's how how he moves, right? And I think that's ultimately what you're looking for. So obviously, there's like a sweet spot of that movement, which is like to me, it's like 6'7" and below, and probably above 6'2" or 6'3", right? Usually, those 6'2", 6'3" guys have shorter arms, so it's maybe 6'4" to 6'7". It's kind of that sweet spot. Now you're going to find guys that fall outside of that 100%, but you're really looking for bend, and then as as guys get taller, those femur lengths get longer. It's just harder for them to move with the smaller. You talked about Trent. The hardest thing he's got to do is block someone in space or block a linebacker. Like that's something that those tall guys have a hard time with. And there's a guy from his name's Lutz from North Carolina who can move like he's 6'8". He can move like a deer. He runs, but then when he has to block at the second level and get down and sink his pads, he gets chinned all the time because he's so damn tall. Like he's movement wise, you're like yes, but then you lose some of that girth, some of that size because it's all stretched out in this tall frame. So to me, I do think there are too tall, right? And again, if you find a 6'9" guy who, like, let's say LeBron James put on 200 pounds and played left tackle, like you'd be pretty stoked on that, right? Because he's got the length and he can bend and do all those different things.
I mean, Jonathan Ogden's one of the greatest of all time, and he was 6'9".
Great example. But like when you watch him, he can just sink and bend and be athletic. And, he was I think he was like, but almost an Olympic caliber thrower in college, right? Track athlete.
Yeah.
Like he could just get shot at all that kind of stuff. So from an explosive standpoint, it's all there. But there's a reason we can remember Jonathan Ogden 6'9". Oh, Jordan Mailata 6'9" is because those dudes who are that kind of athlete tend not to be playing football. They tend to be playing basketball, usually, right? If you can go play basketball or football and you're 6'8", 6'9", like even what's his name? DeJuan Jones. Like when he was coming out from Ohio State, he's 6'8". He said his first love was basketball, and if he could play basketball, he'd be playing basketball. But you just get bigger, and it's like, okay, you're a good athlete, but we got to move you to offensive line because you're so damn big. So there's a reason that all those guys just in the American sports system don't show up a lot here because the better athletes are playing a different sport.
Wrapping up this edition of Take Command, Craig Hoffman here, Logan Paulsen there, and we're going to talk more about the line of scrimmage, but this time on the defensive side of it. We got a John Allen, Daron Payne question in a few, Logan, but starting off with Johnny Newton and Brian, who we just heard from on the offensive line side, also had a part two, and since both of his questions are good, we're going to take them. I'm not panicking or anything, but even as Johnny Newton likely will benefit from a healthy offseason, he is a bit small. Would he maybe make a better edge player than an interior player? With his quickness and relentlessness, it seems like he'd be pretty dangerous there, even if he might not be the speediest at running the hoop, or is that dumb? I would just start with this on a blanket level. If you want someone to switch positions at the professional level, your idea probably is not baked all the way through. And I don't know why we get a million of these. And I'm saying this, I'm trying to say this both nicely and because Brian had the self-awareness to be like, is this dumb? For some sliding over one position on the defensive line for a guy who's got a ton of quickness, et cetera, like we'll talk about it. This is not the worst one that I've gotten, but like you see, Luke McCaffrey should switch to running back. I'm like, why? Because his last name's McCaffrey. This guy should switch from corner to safety. This guy should switch from safety to corner. And it's like, if they have made it all the way to the professionals, chances are they're probably in their best position. Some guys can move. It's not totally impossible depending on what the move is. But generally speaking, should this guy switch positions? The answer is no. I tend to think that for Johnny Newton, the answer is going to be no. In part because of that size. If you think of the best edge players, they are big, long, athletic types. Like you want to talk about some basketball players like Myles Garrett, as the best edge, Micah Parsons, like those guys could go play basketball. And in fact, both those two in particular have played in the NBA celebrity game and shown themselves decently well, dunking on people, etc. So from a length standpoint, that what you need to manipulate the space out on the edge, I do not think that is where Johnny Newton is going to be best because he's a shorter, stockier guy. That quickness that he has, the explosiveness that he has is probably more useful on the interior. But Logan, your thoughts more than welcome here on Newton and kind of where he stands and his best usage moving forward.
Yeah, I kind of see it the same way. And again, so I think this is an interesting conversation about switching positions just in general. Like, obviously, taking Luke McCaffrey and putting him at a running back, like everyone says, oh, he just handled the ball and everything's great. But there's a protection element, there's a physicality element. And like, I think about Niles Paul switching from receiver to tight end. And I've worked with a lot of receivers who are switching to tight end in another business that I work on, right? And one of the things is like, yeah, like you're a great athlete, you can run routes, but there's a physical component to this position that in your last position you were lacking, right? You just weren't able to accommodate. And so I will say the one thing about Johnny moving from defensive tackle to potentially defensive end or like an edge position is that the physicality is approximately the same. So like one of the hardest things in terms of the transition, he's already kind of got that in the bag. Now, I think the thing that you alluded to is like the thing that makes it problematic, right? Is that like there's a reason he's playing defensive tackle, right? He's got 32 and 3/8 arms, which is not what you want to see from an elite edge, right? He's got a good get off, but not a great get off. Like there's a different type of get off from a defensive tackle to a defensive end. So on first and second down, do I think it's reasonable that he plays like the big end? I think that's entirely reasonable, right? Because he's going to be head up over a tight end. He's going to work his get off. He's going to work hands. He's going to violently shed. And I think that would be totally fine for him.
Right. If they want that package where Daron played edge, turn into Johnny at some point in the next couple of years, he could do that just fine.
I think that's totally fine. Right. But again, like in terms of rushing the passer from that position, I think people sleep on the amount of stride length required to really affect an elite tackle, right? Like you just have to cover ground in a different way. So like I've coached defensive tackles as a pass rusher. I've coached defensive ends. I'll tell you, it feels different coming off the line of scrimmage, right? Their ability to kind of be explosive off those first two steps and really threaten and challenge that outside shoulder of the tackle, it's a different ball of wax. Now, is it good to throw different body types at tackles? Yeah, because I think there's a reason that, sometimes you put a defensive tackle out there, they're not used to kind of dealing with that power and that strength. So do I think there's situational opportunities for that? But in terms of long-term, what's best for Johnny Newton, I don't think this would be best for him, right? And I do think that like, one of the things about Johnny is that he was banged up all offseason, banged up for a big chunk of the season, coming into the season with the foot, right? So he didn't really have an opportunity to like develop. I do think when you look at the league, right, if you have elite quickness, you can be devastating on the interior. You can absolutely be devastating. And so if he can kind of figure out some tells, understand situationally, like when he can be super aggressive, again, that's part of it, right? I think the athlete is fine. I think the measurables for defensive tackle are fine. I think the size is even fine, but you got to know when you got to gamble a little bit, right? When you're a quick, explosive defensive tackle, like the bigger guys, yeah, they don't need to gamble as much. They're big. They can use their hands, throw people down. Like Chris Jones, like he's gambling a little bit, but he's long, he's strong. He can do everything you need him to do. Johnny's got to be a little bit more aggressive gambling, kind of taking his opportunities. And I think as you play more professional football, you can do that, right? So like I get used to the snap count. I get used to the checks. I get used to the calls of the offensive line. Like when you're at the line of scrimmage, sometimes you can hear it on the TV copy if you listen closely. They'll be like, hey, doom, 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 doom. That's a duo. That's a call that every team uses for duo or a gap scheme run, right? So if I'm Johnny and I'm playing 3 technique and they're calling doom, I know that I can split this double team right now. I can widen, and you see Payne do it sometimes. He'll hear the call, he'll widen out, he'll split the gap. I think that's something that'll just make him more effective. Is he ever going to be a great run-stopping player? Probably not. Like that's just not in his DNA. But can he be disruptive? Absolutely. And I think that's going to get better as he plays more NFL football.
And if you think of how this defense is kind of designed, I mean, look, would they love to be stout against the run? Yes. But they made choices in terms of personnel and style of play that I think a disruptor is more of what they want. Like they're willing to give up the 6-7 yards, even the 12-yard run. If then on the very next play you try to run it again, and now you're in 2nd and 14 because Johnny Newton, after getting pushed out of the way on the first run, splits a double team and makes a TFL on the second one. Like that's how they're designed to get stops. Can we get in bad down and distance for an offense and then make a play because we can now dial up our blitz package, or we can jump routes, or we can do whatever we need to do to generate the turnovers, or create the variance in the game that we want. And so I think that's a choice. I do think that finding the right pairing for someone like Johnny is really important, and I think that's something that Dan ultimately never did in Dallas. And obviously that Green Bay game is going to live in Cowboys infamy forever in the playoffs. And obviously, the way the Eagles ran on Washington in the NFC Championship game is something that will live in Washington infamy forever, added to the many games of infamy that Saquon Barkley created in 2024. But at the end of the day, like Jer'Zhan's, I think the biggest thing here that Brian mentions is, I know he has a healthy offseason, and that should matter. Like, we shouldn't blow past that. This is a guy that missed the entire offseason and then missed the entirety of training camp for his second surgery. So his ability to just be healthy going into an offseason will completely change, or should, I should say, completely change who he is as a player in 2025, because he will have a year of experience. He'll be able to go through the offseason program. He'll be able to go through the offseason weight program. And participate in OTAs and the whole thing. So I just think it's a totally different season for Johnny Newton, and that's exciting in a lot of ways.
No, I kind of see it the same way. And again, like with, we were talking about Jayden Daniels having a sophomore slump. Like, I think a lot of people overestimate, again, because of what Jayden Daniels did. And when you see a good rookie, like think about like Marvin Harrison Jr. or Roma Dunze, these guys that were generational, infallible prospects, and they struggled this year, right? I think that there's a steep learning curve. All the stuff you get away with, and I'll tell you firsthand, like it's steep. Like all the stuff you get away with in college, I'm a little late in the snap count, I'm a little loose in my hands, like no chance, bro. Like you got to tighten that stuff up. And so that's what we talked about at the top with Jayden, is like, as long as you keep sharpening the sword, you can become a dangerous player in the NFL, right? And I think like hopefully Johnny will take this time where he's healthy, he's not prepping for the combine, he's not dealing with a broken foot this whole offseason, right? And get it right. And I think like that's ultimately what you're banking on. Is when you watch him on film, he is a commander. Like when you watch his college film from Iowa, right? Illinois. He's Illinois, yeah. He's physical, he's aggressive, he runs to the football, and he finishes every play. And so if that gives you a really solid floor to a player, and now you just got to figure out like that technical, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? Go from being a good college player to a solid NFL player, and hand placement, get off, understanding situation, all of those things kind of roll into one. And I also think about this, man, like he did not have time to own the defense. Like he just didn't. No. I know defensive tackles like relatively straightforward, but like there's shading to this that is lost when you lose training camp reps. And I think that's also important.
Well, and he also went from missing training camp reps to starting because John got hurt. Right. Like the ramp was like, hey, guess what? We just steepened your ramp by about 60 degrees here. But you went from like a nice, easy hint to we're going straight up. Yeah. Real quick, as you were talking there, a story that you've told before on the pod, probably early days. So we have thousands upon thousands of new listeners at this point. Hey, everybody. There's a story you told about you and Cooley watching film and you getting like the snap count and your reaction time to illustrate like those nuances and how much that little stuff matters. Can you retell that story real quick?
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite stories, and it's one that I share with all of my clients basically. And so one of the things that, like when I'm in the league, right, I was talking to Cooley and he's like, man, you're not getting off on the ball. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like it's, White 80, Whitey said hut. I go when he said hut. And he goes like, come here, check this out. And so we go into the film room and he goes, play, pause, play, pause, play, pause. And the whole offensive line is leaving and I'm still in my stance. I was like, that's crazy. He's like, go talk to Rybach, who was the center at the time. Go talk to Will Montgomery, find out when they're actually snapping it. So then I go talk to Rybach, and Rybach actually was snapping it on the S of set. So like White 80 set, as I was going on hut. So I was like a full beat behind everybody else in the run game. And so that was something that like I thought about, and I was like, that's something that I have control over, I can own. But that I had gone through all of the offseason and we were in training camp at that point, and no one had said anything to me about it because it was such a subtle thing. And to Cooley's credit, like he was so locked in and he could see it. So he was like, dude, why are you so late off the ball? And no one would say anything. No one, like it didn't come up. But those are the types of details and the type of margin for error that you're negotiating there at the NFL level. Like it's something in college I never even thought twice about. It never came up. I could be laid off the ball, I could still cut a guy out. I could be laid off the ball and still get a man reach. But when those dudes are better and they've got that step, you're putting yourself behind the 8 ball. And so again, that's a subtle thing. That's like, tenths of it, not even hundredths of a second. But that hundredths of a second, I will say, probably saved my career that year because it allowed me to be an effective player and understand, again, it was illuminating because it showed me the margin for error. There's no slack in the rope in the NFL game, right? Everybody's locked in. Linebackers know what you're doing. Like watching London Fletcher, when you get to the line of scrimmage versus London Fletcher in practice, and he's going, hey, it's run to the left, you better believe you're not laid off the ball because he's normally right? Luke Kuechly, him calling plays out at the line of scrimmage, like I got to be on my horse on this double team to make sure that I can get to where I got to go. And if I'm a fraction of a second late, I'm in trouble. And so I think that's kind of what you're seeing here with Johnny. He lost all of that developmental time to kind of take the slack out of his game. And I think, again, he's a guy that I'm betting on because of how he works and how he preps. And just watching him in college, like even this is not a strength conditioning podcast, but
we might have one next week.
Yeah.
Hey,
but the thing that gets me is like, think about the conditioning level. Like his conditioning level, he was not there. Like the whole reason you have this off season is to make sure that you're ready for the regular season. You lost all of it. Like even like running and lifting, like you're not where you need to be. And so I'm very confident he'll figure it out and be able to play inside.
For sure. And by the way, that wasn't just that was a reference to the fact that we have 2 years in a row done our crossover edition of my training podcast and this podcast that at the Indianapolis Scouting Combine, and we are hoping to do that next Thursday. So be on the lookout for that. All right, last question of the pod, Logan, goes to Jay from Bel Air. Jay says, the consensus seems to be to cut John Allen and keep Daron Payne. What's your thoughts on extending or reworking Allen's contract and trading Payne? Payne had a great season when he was up for a new contract, but he has not played up to that season since. I don't see him with the team beyond his current contract. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping things real quick before we get into whatever else we want to say on this from an analysis standpoint. Daron has 2 years left on his deal. His age 28 and 29 seasons. This year he has a base salary of $19.5 million.
Yeah.
19,560,000. If they want to say it the long way. Prorated signing bonus money. So this is money that the Commanders will have on the cap no matter what. $5.6 million. He's also got a workout bonus in there. He's got $9 million in guaranteed money. So no matter what this year, because that $9 million is guaranteed, and he's got 5.6 in the prorated signing bonus, they would have 16.8 in dead money if they traded him. So if they trade him,
oh, wow.
They would save 9.3 if they trade him because the difference in the guaranteed money versus the rest of the base salary. But they still, if they trade him pre-June 1, they have a 16.8 dead cap number. Now, if they can do this trade this summer somehow, where they do a post-June 1 trade, then it becomes very worth it. They have 5.6 in dead money, which they will have no matter what the next 3 years because they've got the prorated signing bonus. And then they save $20.5 million. So trading Daron is not out of the equation. 16.8 is a lot of dead cap money. But I think that is worth pointing out before we even talk about what we think of John and Daron as players. Meanwhile, John, if you were to just straight up cut him pre-June 1 this year, you have $6 million in dead cap money from his prorated signing bonus, and you have $16.4 million in cap savings. So you can create about $16 million of space by cutting him. Doesn't matter pre or post June 1st because this is the actual last year of his deal. There's not even any void years after it. And yeah, that's kind of the John Allen story from a contractual standpoint.
Yeah. This is a tough conversation to have because it's guys that have committed a lot and done a lot for the organization. I will say about the question, like Daron Payne has produced at the exact same level throughout his career. And so what I would say to that is people are like, oh, he had 13 sacks 1 year. His pressure rate is like 9.1, almost on the dot.
I think, can I rephrase that for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I say he's played at the exact same level? He has not produced at the same level because the 1 year that play level turned into a lot higher rate of production because he finished a ton of sacks.
Yeah, so he's been the same guy. So like when I hear fans get frustrated, it's because like he's not getting 13 sacks. I understand the frustration, but it's also like this is who he is. He's a good athlete, good physicality. Good on first and second down, has some decent pass rush use, not that top tier, S tier pass rusher, but he's a good defensive tackle. Now, I think the question becomes is like, is it worth what you're paying him? And I think with the way the tackle market's going, it's actually like kind of becoming like a kind of not a middle of the road deal, but kind of upper middle class kind of deal for defensive tackle because everyone's getting paid a lot of money. So I don't know. I think we'll see. I would defer to Adam on all this stuff, obviously.
Of course.
But so if I'm talking about Daron specifically, I would talk to the coaches and be like, hey, like, where do you see him? Like, what's his role? Like, how do you feel about him as a player? I'm sure that they like him. I'm sure that because again, when you watch the film, like, does he have ups and downs? Yes, every player does. But does he still have flashes? Can he still set a double team at times? Yes. Can he be disruptive? Yes. All those things. I think the number associated with him has a lot of fans expecting something different. But like, this is who he is. And he's been pretty consistent with it his entire career, right? John is a different story to me. Like that becomes a little bit different because there's no tie to it really, right? They didn't draft him. They didn't bring him in. It's a big cap hit if they do keep him for the season. So that becomes a little bit more interesting. A restructure, like let's say John is willing to come back at like, I don't know, $8 million a year on a restructure, $9 million a year, $10 million a year on a restructure. You're probably going to kick the tires on that and see how he feels about it. I don't know if John would want that. That's the thing. Like, I don't know if because he views himself as a $20 million a year type guy, but is he still that? I don't know. Does this organization view him that way? And these are some of the hard decisions you got to make. So to me, I think that's why it becomes so easy to have the conversation about John and cutting him is because the money is so favorable for the cut. Like right now, like you're saving so much money. Think about, what'd you say? 16.5 is that what you said?
Yeah. 16.4. Yeah.
That's 3 players if you want, right? That's 3 players, role players in an offense or a defense that can make you a better football team and that's tied up with him. So is he worth 3 players right now at this point in his career? And again, I'm not opposed to a restructure. I'm not. Like he still does some stuff as a defensive player that is very, very good, but I don't think he's worth that $20 million number anymore. And again, like the staff might feel differently and I would defer to them on this, but that's something that again, because of how the contracts are worked at the moment, I think you probably end up keeping Daron, right? Because again, you have so much guaranteed money tied up with it. And then John feels like a more natural one and again, they might feel like we can restructure this and John wants to stay, John wants to retire commander, all those different things. But as of right now, just based on deal structure, I'm kind of like, it feels easier to move on from John.
And the way a restructure would work is John would get more money, but less per year. And that way it works for both sides. So let's say his base this year is 15.5. Let's say they say, hey man, we'll offer you 2 for 20. So you're going to definitely get $20 million guaranteed.
Right.
But it's over 2 years. Now your cap hit is $10 million. And that's a very oversimplified deal. Because that's like no signing bonus, whatever. But like that's the kind of way that it would work to do that. The other thing is like, I don't know if there's not an easy way to say this, but like, I don't know how much John fits in what they want to do. Like, not just because John's been a leader and everything, but I think it just might. Here's the way I'll say it. I think it might be time for a fresh start for everybody in that relationship. I think that there was some stuff that happened in the acclimation process, whatever. I don't have it on good enough everything to like go too deep into it, but I definitely think that there were times last year where there was some push and pull with how they wanted to do things, and John was an incumbent, and that's something that I think bubbled out into the press and whatever at times. There's other people that have talked about this a little bit more that might have a little bit more detail and reporting on it, but I think John's given a lot to this organization. He's from here. It's a great story, the whole deal. I just think it might be time to hit the eject button and start fresh, and it makes sense financially to do that. So the idea of extending him and bringing him more, especially like, hey, here's a guy who still views himself up here, and we're going to ask him down here, and even if he accepts it, like how happy is he going to be about that? I don't know that I want that kind of friction in my building either. So it might be best to just be like, hey, man, thanks for everything. We might retire your number one day. I don't know if John actually got to that point, but like, you can tell him that on the way out, make him feel good. We'll welcome you back for alumni events, that's for sure. Yeah. And that's that. So Daron, I think is one to watch, obviously in a trade if the Myles Garrett thing comes about. But at the end of the day, I think Daron's going to be here for one more year, and then we're having the same discussion about Daron next year because he'll be entering the final year of his deal, and the math will math in a way that makes a lot of sense to move on from him. And then for John, I just think this is the end of the road for all of the reasons.
Yeah. And, I as a former player, I have a really hard time talking about money for players because I'm always I always want players to make as much money as possible. And I don't want guys to get cut. This is a funny situation though, right? Because it's like, this is one of those things where it's like father time waits for no man. And speaking from experience, like as a player, you don't know that you're like done. You never know. Like you always think you've still got more in the tank. You still think you're the best player, best version of yourself, but that's not true. It's like you don't know it's true until you look back on it and reflect. So right. I think that's why these conversations, I mean, this probably sounds a little awkward between this dialogue right now, but it's I hate John,
it too, to be clear.
John, I want John to make $20 million this year. I want him to make that, but is it the right situation here for him and for the team? I'm not sure. Same thing with Daron, man. Like I think Daron is a good football player, and we can talk about value, absolute value of the contract, all those things, but ultimately, like the team paid him a contract, he's getting paid that money, and I'm happy for him. And I think that's where it's weird to have these conversations because, like, I don't want to be messing with someone's livelihood, right? Like,
totally.
That's the thing that's weird.
And like, even talking about like, hey, trade Daron for Myles Garrett, no brainer. Right. It's like that's a human being. Like, the way we commoditize players and treat them as commodities is, unfortunately, just a part of the job. Like, we have to do it because that's how the market works. And at least in the NFL, like, hey, sorry, Daron, you're going to have to go live in Cleveland and you're a Brown now, but you're making $20 million a year. Like there's only so much you're going to cry for a guy who's making that much money. That's generational type money as opposed to some other leagues that are lower down the scale where look, the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League, has banned trades without player consent, which I think is great, especially that was part of their previous CBA, but like they don't make enough money to just be shipped across the country. Right. Like that's insane at the salaries that they're making compared to what NFL guys or NBA guys are making. It's a lot easier to have those discussions when at least you know that they're not only are they going to be fine, but like their family is going to be fine for generations off of the money they made. But that said, like they're still human beings, and we owe them that humanity to just not be like, yeah, just cut him. Yeah, whatever happens to him, I don't care. So it's not that. It's just like the reality of the business and talking about it in that way. But I think it's good for us to acknowledge that every so often, if not every time that we talk about it. Okay, that's our show for today. Next show, mock draft. We'll take a look at who might be on the board for the Commanders at 29, and we'll also take a look at what trades might be worth making leading up to 29. That'll come out on Thursday morning, and then next week we'll talk to you from Indianapolis at the NFL Scouting Combine. For Logan, I'm Craig. We'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.